By the spring of 1945, the German heavy tanks still cast a long shadow over the Eastern Front. The Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger. Thick frontal armor, long high-velocity guns, and a habit of knocking out Soviet vehicles from well outside their own range. For years, Red Army crews had paid in steel for every one of those machines they stopped. And the men in Moscow understood that the answer was not going to be a bigger, heavier tank of their own. It was going to be a Hunter. Something low to the ground, quick to build, and carrying a gun heavy enough to drive a shot clean through a Tiger at long range. They called it the SU-100, and in the muddy hills west of a Hungarian lake, this machine would help shatter the last great tank offensive that Nazi Germany ever launched. This is the story of the SU-100 and the fury it unleashed at Lake Balaton. To understand why the Red Army built this thing, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve. By the middle of the war, the German heavies had grown heavier still. The frontal armor on a Panther was sloped and thick. The front of a Tiger was a slab, and the newest monster, the King Tiger, carried a face of armor that shrugged off almost every Soviet anti-tank round then in service at anything but suicidal range. The Soviet self-propelled guns that had done such good work in 1943, the ones built to support infantry and defeat medium tanks, were beginning to run out of punch against the heaviest German steel. Soviet crews found themselves having to maneuver for a shot into the thinner side armor, exposing themselves in the process. That was a losing trade. The Red Army wanted a machine that could sit still, at distance, and defeat a heavy German tank from the front. And to do that, it needed a truly heavy gun. So the designers went looking for the largest, hardest-hitting gun they could reasonably fit onto a proven, fast chassis. And they found the heart of it, oddly enough, at sea. The gun that would define the SU-100 was the 100mm D-10s. And its bloodline did not begin on any battlefield. It was developed from a Soviet naval gun, a weapon originally designed to be mounted on a warship, then reworked and adapted for a fighting vehicle. The letter in its name stood for the Russian word for self-propelled, marking it out as the tank hunting version of that naval weapon. And that seafaring heritage gave it qualities that ordinary field guns simply did not have. A very long barrel, roughly 56 calibers in length, a large, powerful cartridge, and a shell that left the muzzle at tremendous speed. When the D-10S fired an armor-piercing round, that shell tore out of the barrel at close to 3,000 feet per second. Consider what that means. A solid projectile crossing more than half a mile of open ground in about the time it takes to blink. Speed like that is everything in a tank duel. It flattens the arc of the shot so the gunner does not have to guess so carefully at range. And it delivers raw energy on impact, and energy is what defeats armor. The result on the receiving end was brutal and decisive. At a range of about 1,000 yards, the armor-piercing shell from the 100mm D-10s could punch through just over 7 inches of vertical armor. That figure was enough to defeat the front of a Panther cleanly. It was enough to threaten a Tiger. And at the shorter ranges, where most engagements were actually decided, it could bury a round deep inside almost anything the Germans could put in front of it. For the first time, a Soviet crew did not have to sneak around to the flank of a heavy tank and pray. They could meet it head-on, at distance, and win the exchange. That was the promise of the D-10s. And now it needed a machine to carry it. The Soviets built that machine on the chassis of the T-34-85, the finest medium tank of the war, a design already in mass production, and already famous for its reliability and its ability to cross ground that stopped heavier vehicles cold. Onto that trusted chassis they fixed a low, well-sloped armoured casemate, and inside that casemate they mounted the big 100mm gun. The whole vehicle weighed in at around 35 tons, light and nimble by the standards of the guns it was built to kill. Its frontal armour ran up to roughly 3 inches thick, angled to deflect. Its diesel engine put out over 500 horsepower, giving it real speed and range across country. A raised cupola on the right of the roof gave the commander his eyes on the battlefield. But the single most important design choice was what the SU-100 did not have. It had no rotating turret. The big gun sat fixed in the front of the hull, with only a narrow arc of movement to left and right. To swing onto a target well off to the side, the entire vehicle had to pivot on its tracks. In a swirling close-range brawl, that was a genuine weakness, and every crew knew it. But that one omission brought the Soviets 3 enormous advantages, and each of them mattered. First, without the weight and complexity of a turret ring wide enough to swallow a 100mm gun, the machine stayed light, low, and mechanically simple. Second, that low, flat profile made it brutally hard to see, especially when it was dug into the earth with only its sloped front showing above the soil. And third, it was faster and far cheaper to build than any turreted tank carrying the same gun. In a war of production where the next month's victory went to the side that could field more steel cheap and fast was a weapon all by itself. So the SU-100 was never meant to lead a charge across open country. It was built to wait, to sit in ambush, hull down and half buried, engine quiet, and to reach out and neutralize German armor at exactly the ranges where its long naval gun ruled. It was a defensive counterpuncher, a machine that turned patience and position into firepower. The factory that gave it life was Uralmash in Sverdlovsk, deep in the Ural Mountains, far beyond the reach of any German bomber. The first of these hunters rolled out the gates in the autumn of 1944, and the line kept running hard through the end of the war and beyond. By early 1946, more than 3,000 of them had been built. The crews who received them understood at once what they were holding. Here, finally, was a gun that could kill the things that had been killing them. The SU-100 had already seen its first action that winter, committed in small numbers as the Red Army pressed into Hungary. But it had not yet fought the battle that would define it. That test was coming, and it would arrive in the worst possible place, at the worst possible time, against the single strongest armoured force Germany had left in the field. To understand why Lake Balaton mattered so much, you have to understand what the Third Reich was running out of: fuel. By 1945, Germany was starving for oil. Its synthetic fuel plants were rubble under Allied bombing. Its refineries were wrecked, and one of the very last significant sources of natural oil still in Axis hands lay in western Hungary, near Lake Balaton. Without that oil, German tanks and aircraft were nothing but expensive metal that could not move. So Hitler made a decision that stunned his own generals. At the exact moment the Red Army was closing in on Berlin from the east, he ordered his most powerful surviving armoured force to turn away from the defence of the capital, march south into Hungary, and attack. The force chosen for this was the 6th SS Panzer Army under one of Hitler's oldest subordinates, Sepp Dietrich. And these were not scraped-together leftovers. This army had spearheaded the great German gamble in the West only weeks earlier, the offensive in the Ardennes, and now it had been pulled all the way across Europe to try one more breakthrough in the East. Under Dietrich stood the elite armoured divisions of the Waffen-SS, organised into the 1st and 2nd SS Panzer Corps, names that had led German attacks since the earliest days of the Eastern Front. Alongside them fought the divisions of the 6th Army, and to the south a 2nd Panzer Army. Together the offensive massed 10 panzer divisions and 5 infantry divisions, hundreds of tanks and assault guns, including a heavy contingent of the newest and largest machine of all, the King Tiger. The operation was named Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening. The plan was a classic pincer, striking north and south of Lake Balaton, driving to the Danube, encircling the Soviet forces of the Third Ukrainian Front, retaking the oil, and slamming the door shut on the Soviet road to Vienna. On paper, it was a hammer. In reality, it was about to be swung against an anvil the Germans had badly underestimated. If you are finding this breakdown useful, take a second to subscribe. This channel goes deep on the machines and the battles of the Eastern Front, one weapon at a time, and there is much more coming. Back to Hungary and the trap that was waiting. The blow fell in the early hours of the 6th of March 1945. The Germans opened with only a short artillery preparation, barely half an hour of shelling, deliberately brief so as not to give away the scale of what was coming. Then the armour rolled forward, north and south of the lake, across a broad front. In the north, the panzer divisions of the 3rd Panzer Corps pushed off behind a battalion of King Tigers, using those heavy machines to blast a path through the forward Soviet positions, and clawed forward a little over a mile on that first day. To the east, the 23rd Panzer Division drove toward the village of Saragres, pressing on despite heavy Soviet anti-tank and artillery fire pouring across the Sarvis Canal. For a few hours, on the maps at least, the offensive looked like it was moving. And then the Germans ran headlong into two enemies at once. One was the Red Army. The other was the ground itself. The attack had been launched just as the winter freeze broke, and across western Hungary the hard earth softened and then dissolved. Roads turned to soup, fields became bogs, and the heavier the vehicle, the deeper it sank. For the King Tiger, weighing close to 70 tons, this was a sentence passed before a single shot was aimed at it. 15 of those massive machines simply settled into the mud up to their turrets and stopped, stranded where they stood. In all, more than 130 German tanks bogged down across the battlefield and went nowhere at all. The German operations staff reportedly judged the conditions as making a proper panzer attack out of the question. In places, the great armoured offensive was reduced to infantry wading forward through the muck, without their tanks. That was the first blow to Spring Awakening, and the Germans had dealt it to themselves by ignoring the weather. The second blow was waiting for them, dug into the earth, gun barrels already laid down the killing lanes. And a great deal of that second blow was the SU-100. The Soviets had not been caught by surprise. Despite German efforts to keep the operation secret, Red Army reconnaissance had detected the build-up, and the command of the 3rd Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Tolbukhin, knew a heavy armoured strike was coming. So they reached back to the hardest and most valuable lesson of the entire Eastern Front. At Kursk in 1943, the Red Army had learned exactly how to break a German armoured offensive, not by meeting it steel for steel in the open, but by letting it drive into a deep, layered wall of anti-tank fire until it bled out. And around Lake Balaton, the Soviets built that wall again, deliberately and methodically. 66 separate anti-tank killing zones laid out across more than 50 miles of front. Some of the defensive belts reached nearly 20 miles deep. Roughly 2/3 of all the artillery in the sector was pushed forward into the anti-tank role. Tolbukhin arranged his armies to absorb the pressure and hold the vital ground. General Gagin's 26th Army held the Axis. Tolbukhin judged most dangerous the ground between the Sarvis Canal and Lake Balaton, and from the night of the 9th the reserve 27th Army was fed in to firm up the line further north. This was a landscape engineered for a single purpose: to swallow tanks. And into that landscape the Soviets fed their hunters. By the 10th of March, 188 SU-100s had been concentrated in the Balaton area, gathered into powerful self-propelled artillery brigades. The weight of the tank hunting fell on the 207th, the 208th, and the 209th Brigades. These were not scattered handfuls of vehicles. This was massed firepower, positioned precisely where the German armour was forced to come. The way the SU-100 crews fought was a lesson in cold discipline. The vehicles were dug into the ground among the infantry positions, or held concealed in ambush, engines silent and guns cold. They did not go looking for a battle, they made the Germans come to them. And when the Panzers rolled into view at a range somewhere between 1,000 and 1,600 yards, the hunters went to work. The routine was methodical and merciless. A German column would appear across the killing zone. An SU-100 would ease forward out of cover into its prepared firing position, its long 100mm gun already laid on the approach. It would fire several fast, flat rounds into the advancing armour, and then, before the Germans could pinpoint the muzzle flash and range in for a reply, it would throw itself into reverse and pull straight back behind a fold of ground or a tree line. Fire and vanish. Fire and vanish. Every time the Panzers pressed forward, another hidden gun would speak from an unexpected angle, and another German machine would grind to a halt, smoking. At those ranges, the naval-bred gun was exactly in its element. The flat, fast shell of the D-10S did not have to loop and guess its way to the target. It went where it was aimed and arrived with enough force to defeat the armour it struck. A panther that would have shrugged off a lighter Soviet round found itself stopped cold from the front. This was the entire reason the SU-100 existed, finally paid off in full. Around villages like Saregres and Simontonia, this tactic proved itself over and over. German attacks came in supported by armour, and the dug-in Soviet guns broke them, pulled back, and then broke the next wave that followed. There was nothing glamorous in it, no dramatic charges, just patience, position, and overwhelming firepower applied to an enemy walking into a prepared trap. And, make no mistake, the fighting was savage, and the SU-100 crews took losses of their own. This was no one-sided affair. On the morning of the 12th of March, repeated German attacks supported by armour pushed off from the high ground and dislodged a Soviet regiment and the rifle troops holding beside it, and in that single hard action 17 Zu-100s were knocked out. The Germans were committing their very best divisions and fighting for every yard of ground, but every yard was very nearly all they were getting. Because for all the effort, for all the elite SS divisions and the heavy Tiger battalions thrown into it, the numbers tell the true story of Spring Awakening. Over 10 grinding days, through the mud and the killing zones and the massed Soviet guns, the German offensive managed to claw forward only 9 to 19 miles at its deepest point. That was the sum of it. Not the Danube, not the oil fields secured, not the road to Vienna closed. A shallow, muddy, ruinously expensive dent in the Soviet line, bought with the very last armoured strength the Reich possessed. The hammer had swung, and it had struck the anvil, and it was the hammer that cracked. And then it was the Red Army's turn. On the 16th of March, only one day after the German push had spent the last of itself, the Soviets counterattacked in strength. The result came almost at once. Within a single day, the exhausted, bogged and battered German formations were driven back toward the very positions they had started from. The great pincer that was supposed to reach the Danube folded inward on itself and collapsed. The cost to the Germans was catastrophic and permanent. The 6th SS Panzer Army, that hammer of 10 panzer divisions, had thrown itself against the Soviet anti-tank wall and shattered. From that army alone, more than 250 tanks and self-propelled guns were left behind, wrecked or abandoned across the Hungarian mud, and the wider offensive cost the Germans hundreds more machines still. Many of the intact tanks were simply out of fuel, left sitting where they had rolled to a stop, the exact fuel the whole doomed offensive had been launched to secure. The finest armoured force Nazi Germany had left ceased to exist as an effective fighting formation. It never recovered. It never mounted a serious offensive again. The bitter stories that followed, of Dietrich's elite men being stripped of their honours on Hitler's own order as punishment for the failure, all pointed to the same hard truth. Spring Awakening had not merely failed. It had consumed the last German armoured reserve of the entire war, and left nothing behind but scattered steel in the mud. And the Red Army did not pause to survey the wreckage. On that same day the German operation ended. The Soviets launched their Vienna offensive. The road that the Germans had bled themselves white trying to block now lay wide open. The Soviet armies drove west and north out of the Balaton battlefield, and within weeks Hungary was cleared, and Soviet tanks were rolling toward the Austrian capital. The last great gamble of the German Panzer Army had been spent in full, and the men who spent it had purchased nothing but their own destruction. Standing in the middle of that victory, quiet and low and deadly, was the SU-100. It did not win Lake Balaton alone, and it would be dishonest to say it did. The mud helped. The infantry helped. The mines, the artillery, the